Well, just recently, Monday in fact, the BHA published their fixture list for 2022, and as you can imagine, it's raised a number of talking points. Some people in support of the increase for the weekend fixtures, some people not so happy. But we're going to talk about it with Richard Wayman, who is the Chief Operating Officer for the BHA. Richard, good morning.
Morning, Rishi. Thank you for having me on today.
No, thank you for coming on to chat. Obviously, there are a lot of interesting points that have been raised by the fixture list. What do you think the headlines are that you really wanted to get across? I assume the valuable Sunday meetings is top of the agenda.
Yeah, I think I'd probably start by setting the context in which the fixture list for 2022 was produced, and that's very much that the sport and the fixture list is put together by both the BHA and the racecourses and the sports participants. Was devised with a view to supporting the sport's recovery from what's obviously been a really challenging 18 months, not just for racing, but for everybody. We've had racecourses lose revenues of over £400 million. We had prize money fall last year by 40% compared with 2019. And the horse population, whilst that's actually remained relatively robust, we have seen a fall this year in the number of 2-year-olds and even 3-year-olds. So it's really the fixture list was about trying this year to support the sport's recovery from that difficult period. And basically the headlines from it, I would say, would be that the sport began by saying, we don't want an increase in our fixture list in 2022. I think it was felt that that's not what the sport's customers wanted, and therefore we were working with a similar sort of number to the previous year's fixture lists. But we did really want to concentrate on how we might be able to better serve our customers by introducing 2 or 3 initiatives that could work from that perspective. One of the successes of the last 18 months has been the growth of better fixtures on a Sunday. And when I say better fixtures, higher quality and more prize money. And that's obviously attracted more media coverage and television coverage, and generally been well received by many of the sports customers. And we felt that 2022 gave us an opportunity to build on that. So we've introduced a small number of high value fixtures on Sundays that we hope will continue in that vein from the successes over the last 18 months. So that would be one area, primarily focused on the sort of stay at home and the betting customer of British racing. A second area is we've looked to reintroduce some fixtures that actually many of them were in the fixture list before the pandemic. Some of these additional fixtures on Saturday afternoons. And whilst I'd be the first to say that they aren't really required from a betting perspective, because we know that from a betting perspective, those Saturdays have already got plenty of content on them. What we found in all of these additional fixtures that we'd be looking to put on would be that they would provide opportunities for good crowds. So, Chester, for example, would be taking some of them. They'd be getting in 20,000 people. And not only does that mean that Chester can offer good money on that day, it also obviously allows prize money to be added to other fixtures across the course of the season. So that would be, I would say, a second area. And of course, one of the other balancing acts we have when putting the fixture list together is thinking about all the people that make the fixture list possible, that work day in, day out to service it. And we've introduced a number of initiatives over the years to try and support the participants in those servicing the fixtures, whilst at the same time helping the sport to grow and appeal to its customers. And that's a really tricky balancing act that we face every year. One initiative that we've introduced for 2022 is the introduction of rider restricted meetings. There's just a small number of them, but where we have breaks in the fixture list, we have some code breaks in the fixture list so that the participants involved in those particular codes get a couple of breaks on the flat, a couple on the jumps. We've managed to extend those, certainly for jockeys anyway, by introducing a small number of these rider restricted meetings. And there are those four breaks, a break on the flat in March, and again at the end of the season, and over jumps. Those breaks come in April at the end of the course season, and again at the beginning of August.
Richard, thank you for that. The rider restrictor fixture is obviously very welcome by the PGA, but I wanted to just put to you a couple of things that have been said. And Dale Gibson of the PGA, so obviously he welcomes the blank periods for riders, but he does have significant concerns about the sheer volume of fixtures that still remain for next year. Ed Bethel, who obviously was in the papers recently, he said he's baffled by the addition of 18 Sunday and Saturday fixtures in 22 because the work-life balance for stable staff is tough. What do you say to those two particular comments from Dale Gibson and Ed Bethel?
Well, I certainly understand them and have a degree of sympathy with them. Of course, the other side of the coin and this balancing act that I'm talking about, Rishi, is at the same time we need to generate revenues for the sport so that we can offer better prize money than we've offered in the past, so that we can have more horses and more owners involved in racing, and the sport grows rather than contracts. And we have to walk that fine line between trying to introduce initiatives to help those that service the fixture list. So, obviously in recent years, we've introduced those breaks. We've introduced earlier sort of finish times to evening fixtures. More recently, the 1 meeting a day restriction that's been brought in for jockeys. So there are measures that have been introduced. Of course, it's also worth saying that when we consider these opportunities for the fixture list, there are a number of opportunities that get left on the cutting room floor, as it were, because actually we decided it would be unreasonable to ask the sports participants and everybody else involved in servicing the fixture list to actually do some of the things that potentially might work commercially, but wouldn't necessarily work or be fair and reasonable to ask the sports participants to complete. So it is a fine balance that we have to sort of try and tread between trying to meet the needs of the sports customers who increasingly want racing to take place when they're not working, but at the same time recognise that puts a heavy price on the people within racing who do make that fixture list work. And it's a fine balance that we constantly try to walk. And inevitably, when we issue a fixture list, there will be people that think we haven't quite got that balance right. We have to accept it is difficult to do so.
I appreciate it, and I imagine it is difficult indeed. You talk about the well-being of jockeys, and that has obviously been paramount in the thought process that's gone into the composition of the fixture list. I wanted to ask you about stable staff, which has been a big talking point. Richard Hannon Sr. talked about it, Ed Bethel and others have mentioned it. One or two don't have a problem with it. And whilst the BHA are clearly are concerned about all participants in sport, do you feel the BHA should be responsible for the welfare of stable staff who are asked to work as much as they are because of the fixture list? Or do you feel that responsibility belongs to trainers? Where do you see that fitting?
I don't think there's a black and white answer to that question, because my sense is actually it's a responsibility for the entire sport. I mean, obviously there is an employer and employee relationship between trainers and their staff, and so obviously trainers have a responsibility. And as we're all aware, that there's been progress made in recent years, both in terms of the discussions that go on in the contracts that go on between NTF and NARS, and also some individual practices that different trainers have introduced over the years. And certainly I know from speaking to a number of trainers that they've tried to improve the way that they organise things within their own yards to try and better support their staff. So there's certainly an element of it, of course, being a responsibility for trainers and their staff to try and improve things together for our workforce. But I think there's a broader responsibility for the entire sport, including, of course, within that the BHA. And I think we have always got to be trying to develop ways and think of ways that we can ultimately improve the sort of environment in which our staff are asked to operate. And one of our challenges at the moment is that the way that the sport is funded and the way that the sport's revenues flow, and therefore prize money, is created, is linked to volume. And what I would hope perhaps in future years is that if that current funding model were to evolve, it might be possible at some stages in the future to think about the possibility of creating blank days within the fixture list that could potentially work. But the way that the sport's currently funded, that would be a very expensive a policy for the sport to take, which ultimately impacts prize money, which ultimately impacts owners and horse numbers. And obviously, what we're trying to do is to find ways to improve the way improve the sort of working conditions for our staff, but at the same time not enter into a decline or a contraction that ultimately doesn't serve the industry and the sport in the longer term.
One final thing I want to ask you about, if that's okay, Richard, was about field sizes. And clearly, the stats this year suggest that we do have too many fixtures. I think it's something like 16% for the year that we've had 5 runners or less, and just in the month of August it was around 19%. And obviously when you see statistics like that, people immediately think, well, we've got too much if we're getting such small fields. Obviously this year we've had the Sunday series, we've had the Racing League, etc., that have clearly impacted on the weekend sized fields as well. So with that in mind, I think I think you're 4 fixtures lighter in 2022 in total. I guess there is a feeling within the sport that with those numbers to hand, surely as time goes on, we need to be reducing the number of fixtures in order to sustain field sizes, no?
Obviously, again, I begin to sound like a broken record.
I understand.
There's a balance to strike here, because yes, if we were to stage fewer fixtures, that one would imagine, certainly in the short term, lead to more competitive fields, which of course is something that we would all like to see. All of us, within the sport and certainly within the BHA, we want the most competitive racing possible. When people watch sport, they want to see a competitive product. And small fields, particularly if they are uncompetitive races, they are not serving the sport well. But of course, the flip side of the coin is that if we start taking fixtures races out of the fixture list, then again that comes at a price. The way that the sport's funded through the levy, through the media rights payments made to racecourses, they are linked to volume. So that sort of contraction of fixtures and races would come at a cost that ultimately would mean less prize money and therefore potentially fewer horses. But one thing I just would add, and I acknowledge all the points that you've made around the field sizes and the competitiveness. I think sometimes it is right that we just take a step back and say, well, actually, they're not that different to where we've been in previous years. If you look at the average field size so far this year, 8.7. Well, if we go back to the same period in 2019, before the pandemic, 8.8. The year before that, 8.7. You refer to, the percentage of races not getting 6 runners, 16.1% this year. In 2019, the same period, 15.7%. Now, I'm not saying those numbers are all right. They are not as good as we would like them to be. We want the sport to be more competitive. The point I'm making is they're broadly in line with where we've been for a number of years.
And that in itself may be something that that we need to discuss further. Richard, we'd love to chat further, but we're running out of time. So thank you very much for joining us. Good luck. I'm sure it's not the last time that you'll be talking about the fixture list leading up to the end of the year.
Thanks very much, Rishi.